Howdy, advanced TCLTers. It's Mark Michael Lewis for another Mark Michael Lewis moment thing. So there's a question on the list about the best of both worlds. What does that mean? So best of both worlds is it's rule number 7. Always choose the best of both worlds, and it's on dimension number 7, or I7 of integration. So let's say I7 integration. For those of you who are into Ken Wilber, this is transcend and integrate versus transcend and include, which it has to do with how you take multiple ideas, break them into their component parts, and then take the best of all possible parts. So it's an extension of Ken Wilber's transcend and include to transcend and integrate. For those of you who aren't into Wilber, never mind that. Okay, so the classic best of both worlds is where you distinguish a dimension, define a distinction, then distinguish a separate dimension, define a separate distinction, and then put them together. The classic one that I used was, say, prosperity versus poverty. Right? Distinguish the dimension. The dimension is, what do we wake up with in the morning, right? What's our temporal inheritance? You know, wealth, health, relationships, infrastructure, knowledge. What do we have when we wake up in the morning? What's our temporal inheritance? Well, we can have prosperity or we can have poverty. So we distinguish the dimension and define a distinction. The distinction is between prosperity and prosperity is the good side, since we got to reclaim that word and call it thriving. So that's one dimension. Well, that makes it easy. There's not really much to integrate. You just apply that distinction to any area and choose prosperity. But if we add a separate dimension, we could say, oh, well, we want pleasure versus pain. Again, this is the dimension of phenomenology, what our experience is like. And on that dimension, we want pleasure versus pain. We want joy versus despair. We want ecstasy versus dissociation and numbness. So we define the distinguish the dimension and define the distinction. Now, when both dimensions are shown horizontally, it becomes a little bit trickier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase this, delete it, and I'm going to draw the same dimension, but I'm going to draw it vertically. So in this case, we've got pleasure versus pain. Right? Same principle. We just distinguish a dimension, define a distinction. But now, once we get into horizontal and vertical, it makes sense that we draw a matrix. All right? Where over here is prosperity on that side, and over there is poverty. But up top is pleasure, and down below is pain. So what we notice is we end up with the quadrant, the classic four part quadrant, where we can have, in this corner, we would have pleasure, because it's the upper corner, and poverty, because it's the left corner. So this is pleasure and poverty. Here would be pain and poverty. And here would be pain and prosperity. And then you end up with pleasure, the top half, and prosperity, the right half, this corner. And pleasure and prosperity is what we want. We want the best of both worlds, where we take multiple dimensions and take the best in both of the worlds that that dimension describes or that dimension delineates. So here, the best of both worlds on the dimensions of what we wake up with in the morning, our temporal inheritance, and our phenomenology is prosperity and pleasure. We want the best on both dimensions, or the optimal on both dimensions, the best of both worlds. So I'll take this one dimension further just for fun, and we can say, oh, well, what about a third dimension? I don't know what, oh, I know, let's call it, let's call it purpose versus pointless. And notice I drew that at a 45-degree angle. And the only reason I drew it at a 45-degree angle is because in 3 dimensions, we draw at a 45-degree angle. In truth, if I could draw this really, really well, the first 2 dimensions determine a plane. 2 lines where they cross determine a plane. When you add the third dimension, it creates space, because this is, you could say, the depth dimension. And if I could really draw it, what I would draw is I would draw it straight out. Right? It's actually depth. It's the thing that creates space. But because we're drawing it on a 2-dimensional surface, we draw it as a 45-degree angle. And so we end up with this 3-dimensional cube, where purpose is the front part of the cube, this part of the cube, and pointless is the back part of the cube. So in this case, if we wanted to have the best of both worlds for all 3 dimensions, we would want prosperity on the right half, which puts us here, pleasure on the top half, which puts us in this, and then purpose, the front half, which puts us in this. Puts us in this cube. Right, this cube means that we have the best of both worlds, or in Voltaire's sense, the best of all possible worlds. Right, we live in the best of all possible worlds, or we want to live in the best of all possible worlds, where we've got, once you have the 3 dimensions, you've got 4 here in the front and 4 in the back, 8 possible choices. We choose the 1 out of 8. And that's really the simplest form of what it means to say the best of both worlds. We want to distinguish out the separate dimensions and then take the best on all of the dimensions. When we look at all of the 20 dimensions of the game of thriving, well, then we want, right, we take this cube and break it into pieces, and then we take this cube and break it into pieces. And so we want to take all 20 dimensions and take the best on all 20. And when you've got a binary system, 20 dimensions, that's 1 in a million. Like this is 1 in 8, and then 1 in, and so on. So that's the simplest understanding of the best of both worlds. We want to separate out the different dimensions and then choose the optimal on all of the dimensions, rather than saying, oh, well, I want purpose, but I'm going to be poor and in pain. Or, oh, I want prosperity and pleasure, but I'm going to do it in a pointless way. Right? We want all of it. We want the best of both worlds. So that's the simple, straightforward version. Now, should I go deeper? If you don't want to go deeper, stop the video here. Okay. So, notice that the way I taught it, I've already broken a complex idea down into 3 dimensions. Right? We have the dimension of physical stuff, the material world, what we wake up with in the morning, our temporal inheritance. 1 dimension. We've got a completely separate dimension, which is phenomenology. How do I feel? What's it like to experience it? What's it like to be in my body, to be in my consciousness? And then this 3rd dimension of meaning, what's the story I tell? How does it mean something to me? How does it fit through time? Where am I going? Where have I come from? What's the direction and path? Where is the meaning? Now these are 3 separate dimensions, and when you separate them out, then it's pretty easy to say, oh, well, I want prosperity and pleasure and purpose. However, in most cases in our lives, we have not distinguished the dimensions and defined the distinctions. What we have is just a glob. Like, well, what do I want to do? Well, I want to do this, but if I do this, then I can't do this. Either I make money or I have meaning.